Hey, welcome. So, yeah, today I'm going to be discussing Mars and the potential for human bases actually on the surface of Mars, and namely, quite disturbingly, sort of slave colonies as well, which is quite horrible. It kind of all stems from an interview of David Steele on InfoWars that Alex Jones kind of performed. And David Steele, if you haven't heard of him, is a really interesting guy, and I suggest you kind of search out some of his content. It's pretty enlightening. But he's a former kind of US Marine and CIA official and is a big proponent of open source intelligence. Now, as part of this interview, there was a particular segment that sort of David started talking about, and it sort of goes like this. And this is what caused a kind of controversy and actually kind of leaked into the mainstream as well, quite surprisingly. And he says this, this may strike your listeners as way out, but we actually believe there is a colony on Mars. It is populated by children who were kidnapped and sent into space on a 20-year ride. So once they get to Mars, they have no alternative but to be slaves on Mars colony. And, that's the end of kind of the quote. But that was picked up, surprisingly, by a lot of mainstream outlets around the world. Like, it was reported in the Daily Mail, it was reported in the Daily Star, the Daily Beast, and even the kind of the Washington Post. Now, a lot of them kind of misrepresented what he was saying. Obviously, he did say about colony on Mars and it was slave, but actually a lot of the newspapers were saying he said it was a sex colony. And David still kind of rebuffs that and said, yeah, that's not what I said at all. I've been misquoted. But I think it's like interesting to look at the potential kind of evidence for that. And there's a lot of whistleblowers out there, and as usual, a lot of people sort of tend to claim they're either kind of paid for disinformants or they're kind of making it up. But that's the same with everyone. But I think it's important to kind of cover. And there's kind of a few individuals I want to talk about. There's Al Bielik, there's Michael Relfe, there's Randy Kramer, and also kind of Cory Goode, and they've all had Mars experiences, and a lot of them correlate in terms of what they've said, in terms of the technology they've experienced, and then also their kind of journey with kind of Mars and the kind of the human base that exists there. Sort of going back to sort of David Steele, he sort of was then interviewed on Project Camelot YouTube website by Kerry Cassidy, and initially it started with Kerry interviewing David Steele, and then they actually swapped roles with David actually interviewing Kerry. And again, it all kind of because of like what was reported in the mainstream media, he was surprised how much it blew up. But again, he sort of claims that him and his insiders know that there's 10,000 people on Mars, and NASA lies a lot. And he said it was going to be the final time he was going to talk about this on this particular interview, unless President Trump empowers him to talk about it or he becomes president himself. That's the kind of the final time he's going to mention it. And again, sort of Kerry Cassidy was explaining a lot of the technologies and how she understands that there are portals that allow people to go interstellar and then also to travel to Mars incredibly quickly. And they would use this obviously to transfer technology and people between Earth and kind of Mars. So kind of adding to that evidence that potentially there is human colonies actually on the surface of Mars. Now we can look at other people like Gary McKinnon, who is a British hacker, and he claimed to have hacked into kind of NASA and also Johnson Space Center and uncovered information to do with Solar Warden, which is a particular secret space program, and also details of off-world officers, which kind of claimed, they were kind of naval officers, but not based on Earth. So they were in space, and then also kind of found inventories to do with like the craft that they had, including 8 kind of tubular motherships along with 50 kind of smaller craft. Now, unfortunately, he's got no real evidence in terms of screenshots or downloads of any of the kind of investigations he found through his hacking. But the fact that the US military and the government were after Gary McKinnon so kind of violently, does suggest maybe he did sort of stumble across something. They wanted to extradite him to the US to be charged. Now, this was kind of blocked by the current Conservative government. So he was never actually extradited. But again, there's no real like kind of hard evidence to back up his claims. And then we can look at Al Bielik, who, this is a previous video I've talked about, and he was the kind of the program director for the Montauk project, and namely kind of the mind control aspect to it. Now, I've talked about the Montauk project. It's the inspiration for Stranger Things. It's just a really crazy covert project that's gone on for a very long time and also involves many different strands of kind of technologies. And he kind of has been kind of interviewed numerous occasions, and on one interview, he does claim that 2 million children go missing every single year in the USA. And he also goes to confirm that they kind of messed, and with the Montauk project, they were kind of creating time tunnels for the Montauk project, but then also Project Phoenix. And these kind of portals, time tunnels, kind of gave the Martian colonies actual kind of backup. So obviously, if craft were unable to get to Mars surface for whatever reason, then there were these really quick jump points that would take them from Earth to Mars. So that's his kind of testimony. And also, he was sort of talking about there's a infamous sort of drama that was kind of posed as being a documentary, and it was shown on British television in 1977. It's called Alternative 3, and the whole story sort of arises around the discovery that a lot of scientists and sort of doctors were being sent to Mars, and they were kind of completely disappearing. And this kind of documentary is about a journalist covering this kind of situation. It was released on April Fools, but a lot of people are saying a lot of this information is genuine information, and they were disclosing real life events. Now, Al Bielek claims this is a part of this video, and it shows one of the first landings on the surface of Mars. Again, this is supposed to be like a fake kind of documentary, but Al Bielek sort of claims that this is real footage, flying over the surface of Mars and then landing. Now, if you know British television, generally doesn't have a lot of money. So, and within UK itself, there's no landscapes like that, with that kind of reddish sort of desert kind of landscape. So they wouldn't have filmed it themselves abroad, because they definitely wouldn't have had the money. And there's no sort of like native landscapes like that in the UK. So the only way they could get that kind of content is either it was stock footage or it is genuine. So, I mean, again, you've got to use your own discernment on that, but it's an incredibly explosive claim to sort of say that they actually disclosed a real life video content of landing on Mars. But that's kind of Al Bielek's kind of what he said.
Which you're now about to see as we saw it.
So then we kind of move on to Cory Goode, and his kind of intel and sort of information stretches way back into kind of Nazi kind of World War II period, where the Nazis, SS and the Vril Society, towards the end of the war, they all kind of decamped and moved to the remote areas of Argentina and also kind of Antarctica. And they relied really heavily on slave labor to kind of build their technology and also their bases. Now, it's well known now that the Nazi Party after World War II infiltrated the US military and aspects of their own space program through a thing called Operation Paperclip. Now, to also kind of confirm a lot of this information, Albert Speer, who was a German armaments minister, wrote a book about his experiences and talked about how Himmler wanted to create like a parallel industrial infrastructure. And again, it was all based on a policy of using slave labor to win the law and to build their technology. And they had huge underground facilities, essentially slave labor camps. Now, Cory Goode claims that the ICC, which is the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate, carried on this policy of using slave labor to build their technology. And this building of technology happened on Mars, and they were kind of bartering this technology to 900 other civilizations around the kind of galaxy. Now, it's controversial, but one part of Cory Goode's story that some people believe, some people don't, that he claims that he actually traveled to one of these Mars colonies to do an inspection because they wanted to investigate whether the people who live in these areas, whether they were mistreated, were they actually slaves or not. And so they managed to organize with the kind of leaders of this colony to take one family away and interview them extensively and to see whether they've been mistreated and whether they're happy kind of living there. Now, during this kind of process, they discovered the actual fact that a member of their family was actually missing. So when they confronted the actual commander of this Mars base, he completely lost it, became incredibly angry, and essentially threw them in a detention cell. Now, at this point, they realised that this guy was a complete tyrant and a total megalomaniac, and they understood that actually a lot of the civilians who lived on this base were psychologically manipulated, physically abused, and, by the tyrannical leaders of this base. So again, that kind of adds to the evidence that actually, yeah, they are being used as kind of slave labor, and they are there essentially under kind of duress. Now, again, it's a controversial story, but Michael Salla wrote a very interesting article about how this potentially evidence could be backed up because this inspection apparently happened on the 20th of June 2015. Now, on the 11th of June 2015, the British Interplanetary Society had a 2-day meeting, and they all thought it was a fictitious scenario. And the title for the meeting was "How to Overthrow a Martian Dictatorship." Now, this involved 30 scientists, engineers, and philosophers. And a lot of the information about the background story to this dictatorship correlates a lot with Cory Goode's own intelligence. So that's incredibly interesting around the same period that they're discussing this. And so again, it begs the question whether they were actually using this information that they brought out from the 2-day meeting, whether this was actually implemented in real life. So again, fascinating. Now we can move on to another potential Mars whistleblower, Michael Relfe. He was detailed in a book called The Mars Records, who was actually written by his wife. Now, they met through him being healed because he had a lot of emotional issues, and she was a kinesiologist, and they met in kind of 96. Now, it's through her healing that they had discovered, because he was completely unaware of his kind of covert life because his mind had been wiped, he claims, but they uncovered the covert life. And again, Michael had been involved in a 20-year and back service, such as Cory Goode, Michael Relfe, and also Randy Kramer. They all claim they were in these covert programs for kind of 20 years. Now, he was placed in the Mars Defense Force. Now, his kind of story kind of started all the way back to age 6, where he claims he was abducted on various occasions by grey aliens, and his abilities were updated. Now, this tends to kind of happen with a lot of these people through various family generations. Like, his dad also worked for the government, and he claims he was chosen because of his genetics at school. Now, they made further modifications, genetic modification, and he was also programmed as a child to kind of join the Navy later on in life, which he did. Now, in 1976, he was then asked to join a classified program, which then turned out to be the Mars Defense Force. So for 20 years, he was taken to Mars through a jump gate. Now, this jump gate, he claims, was situated under the Great Lakes base, an underground facility. Now, he was jumped all the way to this Mars base, and at this Mars base, his psychic abilities were enhanced. Now, through this enhancement of his psychic abilities, he was actually trained to be a psychic assassin, and also claims he was incredibly good at his job and actually managed to kill around 70 people purely using his mind, which is pretty disturbing. He also claims that he was put on job rotation as well, so he wasn't always a psychic kind of assassin. He was also trained as a fighter pilot, and again, he was to continue to work for the Mars Defense Force. And he also kind of claims that while he was on Mars, that there was a strict policy of never knowing anything to do with Earth. So you had no current affairs, or you had no kind of contact with family the whole time they were kind of on Mars. So the Earth conversation was completely sort of off limits. And if there were any kind of visiting dignitaries or VIPs at the Mars base, they weren't allowed to talk to them at all. Now, what happens at the end of the sort of 20-year program, Michael claims that in 2002, he was age regressed. And then he was time traveled back to 1976 to then carry on with his normal life back on Earth. It's really hard to wrap your head around this. But again, all these kind of people discuss exactly the same sort of story. Now, during that kind of age regression, he was also fiddled with it. He was implants put in him, and then mind control. So his mind was blank slated. His memories are completely wiped, and these implants also prevented his psychic abilities as well, which caused the emotional problems later on in his life on Earth itself. Now, throughout his time back on Earth, he was sort of forcibly abducted on monthly occasions to be examined, and he claims kind of later on, as he was then healed by his kind of future wife through his kinesiology, he then discovered like who his superior officer was, and he was also able to approach him. And his superior officer then gave him the green light potentially to start talking about his story. So as a kind of disclosure to the population of Earth, to kind of so people potentially understand what is actually going on. So he's another guy who kind of talks about his experiences on Mars. He doesn't talk about slave labor, but he definitely discusses, various bases on Mars itself. Now we can look at Randy Kramer, who's another whistleblower, again, who's had experience with being on Mars. And again, the same with the other whistleblowers, he was in a 20-year militarized space program, and his time was between 87 and 2007. And again, he said that he worked for the Mars Defense Force, protecting various Mars colonies. And Kramer claims that a lot of the colonies were involved in mining, and the whole idea was that they could then try and pay for themselves. And he was sort of detailing how the first mining colony actually was set up in 1975. And again, he talks about how knowing anything to do with Earth and the information that's going on at the time while he's in Mars, again, was completely forbidden. Now, his background, he was kind of during his 20-year tour was as a super soldier. He was like inflicted mind control on him, and again his physical abilities were enhanced. And again, his story starts very early on as a child, when he was 12 years old, through an operation he claims is called Operation Moon Shadow. Now, again, as his kind of memories started to filter back through his kind of life back on Earth, he then again approached his superior officer, who also gave him the green light to start talking about his experiences. That kind of details all the various people that potentially kind of back up David Steele's claim that there are Mars colonies, but then also slave colonies on Mars itself, which is very disturbing. What's really interesting about a lot of these stories, again, a lot of people perceive it as being disinformation, but how all the stories kind of correlate, where they're all on these 20-year and back programs, and the fact that they're all kind of age regressed, and it's really hard to wrap your mind around, but they were then age regressed and then sent back in time to when just before they became an adult, and then allowed to carry on their normal timeline on Earth itself. And it's strange, but then if you kind of read about projects like the Montauk projects and the Phoenix project, you start to get an understanding, and actually these really dark covert circles, they have this kind of technologies potentially to make these scenarios actually work. But yeah, thank you very much for joining me. Take care. Bye bye.